He thought his money made him untouchable. Arrogant, smug, and dripping with entitlement, Ethan Grayson believed the rules didn't apply to him, especially in a courtroom. When the judge entered, everyone stood out of respect. Everyone, except him. He stayed seated, arms crossed, wearing a smug grin like he owned the place. But what he didn't know was that the woman he refused to stand for wasn't just any judge. And what she did next, it left the entire courtroom stunned, with jaws on the floor. Have you ever seen arrogance backfire in real life? Share your story in the comments. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. Ethan Grayson was the kind of man who believed the world revolved around him, and in many ways, it did. A billionaire by 35, thanks to ruthless business deals and connections in all the right places. He had built an empire fueled by arrogance. His suits were custom-made, his cars imported, and his attitude unbearable. He treated people like stepping stones, convinced that respect was something you bought, not earned. Then there was Judge Maya Robinson. She was everything Ethan wasn't, humble, dignified, and sharp as a blade. A woman who had climbed her way to the top through hard work, not handouts. Her courtroom was her kingdom, but she ruled with fairness, not fear. Maya didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. A simple look from her was enough to silence a room. The courtroom was packed that day. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture every detail of Ethan's high-profile trial. The air buzzed with tension, the kind that comes when powerful people finally face consequences. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, leaning back like he was in his living room, smirking as if the trial was just another meeting he could buy his way out of. His lawyer whispered in his ear, but Ethan barely listened. He wasn't worried. After all, he'd faced lawsuits before. What was one more? But this time was different. Because Judge Maya Robinson wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. And what was about to happen would be a lesson Ethan Grayson would never forget. The courtroom grew quiet as the bailiff's voice echoed through the room. All rise for the Honorable Judge Maya Robinson. Everyone stood. Lawyers, reporters, even the security guards lining the walls. Everyone except Ethan Grayson. He stayed seated, legs crossed, tapping his pen against the polished wooden table, like he was waiting for a waiter at an overpriced restaurant. A smug grin stretched across his face as he glanced around, clearly enjoying the attention his defiance created. Whispers rippled through the crowd. People exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes darting between Ethan and the imposing figure now standing at the bench. Judge Maya Robinson didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her glasses, her face calm, betraying none of the tension that suddenly filled the room. Ethan's lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently, "Mr. Grayson, you need to stand." Ethan chuckled under his breath, waving him off. "I don't stand for people who work for me," he muttered, loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. A few pens scribbled faster. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Robinson tapped her gavel once, the sound sharp and deliberate. The room settled into silence. "You may be seated," she announced, her voice steady and authoritative. Everyone sat, except Ethan, who was already slouched comfortably, arms crossed like a rebellious teenager. Judge Robinson's eyes flickered to him briefly. No anger, no surprise, just a cool, measured glance before she turned her attention to the case files in front of her. The trial began. As the prosecution laid out its case, charges of fraud, embezzlement, and corporate misconduct, Ethan remained unfazed. He whispered sarcastic remarks to his lawyer, rolled his eyes at testimonies, and even chuckled during serious statements. It was clear he didn't take any of it seriously. But Judge Robinson never reacted. She listened intently to each witness, asked precise, cutting questions, and maintained perfect composure. To an outsider, it might have seemed like Ethan's arrogance had no effect on her. But beneath that calm exterior, something was brewing. Hours passed. The prosecution rested its case, and it was time for the defense. Ethan's lawyer stood, trying his best to maintain professionalism despite his client's behavior. But it was hard to ignore the elephant in the room, Ethan's blatant disrespect for the court. At one point, during cross-examination, Ethan couldn't help himself. He interrupted the proceedings, waving dismissively at a witness. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "I've built companies bigger than this entire city. You really think any of this matters?" The courtroom gasped. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. Judge Robinson finally set her pen down and looked directly at Ethan for the first time. "Mr. Grayson," she said quietly, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "Do you believe you're above the law?" Ethan smirked. "I believe the law is flexible when you can afford the right people." The room went dead silent. Judge Robinson didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her gavel. She simply leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly. "Approach the bench," she ordered. Ethan hesitated, clearly caught off guard. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, urging him to comply. Reluctantly, Ethan stood, finally, and swaggered toward the bench, his arrogance still intact. But Judge Robinson wasn't done. "Mr. Grayson, let me explain something very simple," she began, her tone sharp as glass. "In this courtroom, your money has no value. Your status holds no power. And your arrogance doesn't intimidate anyone." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but she raised a hand, silencing him effortlessly. "You seem to believe respect is something you're entitled to," she continued, "but respect is not given because of wealth. It's earned through character." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. Judge Robinson leaned in slightly. "And based on your behavior, Mr. Grayson, you've earned none." Ethan's smirk faded. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't angry. But her words hit harder than any outburst ever could. "You may return to your seat," she finished, dismissing him like an unruly child. Ethan turned, walking back to his table with noticeably less swagger. The room watched in stunned silence, the weight of Judge Robinson's words lingering in the air. For the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson realized something money couldn't buy: respect. And it shook him more than he'd ever admit. The courtroom remained tense long after Judge Robinson's powerful words echoed in the air. But Ethan Grayson wasn't done, not by a long shot. His ego, bruised but not broken, simmered beneath the surface. You could see it in the way his jaw clenched, in the glare he shot toward the judge's bench. He wasn't used to being put in his place, especially not in front of an audience. The trial resumed, but the shift in energy was undeniable. The prosecution's questions hit harder, the witnesses spoke with more confidence, and Ethan's defense, it started to unravel. His lawyer fumbled, sensing that the case was slipping through his fingers, while Ethan grew more agitated with every passing minute. And then Ethan snapped. During a heated cross-examination, he slammed his hand on the table, standing abruptly. "This is a joke," he barked, his voice cutting through the courtroom. "You all sit there pretending like any of this matters, like you're better than me." The room went silent again. All eyes turned to Judge Robinson. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke with the same calm authority that had carried her through years on the bench. "Mr. Grayson, approach the bench," she ordered. Ethan stormed forward, his arrogance boiling over. "What? You going to lecture me again?" Judge Robinson leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on his. "No, Mr. Grayson, I'm going to educate you." The words hit harder than any shouted reprimand. You see, respect isn't about standing when someone enters a room. It's about recognizing that the world doesn't revolve around you. It's about understanding that character outweighs currency. And in this courtroom, your money holds no value. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. You think you're better than me? Judge Robinson's eyes didn't waver. Number. But I know I have something you'll never buy. Integrity. Gasps rippled through the room, but she wasn't finished. You walk through life believing rules are for other people, that wealth grants you immunity. But here's the truth, Mr. Grayson. Power without humility is just arrogance. And arrogance, as you're learning today, has consequences. Ethan's face turned red, a mixture of rage and humiliation battling beneath the surface. Judge Robinson leaned back, her expression composed. You may return to your seat. Ethan hesitated, then reluctantly walked back, his defiance deflated, his confidence cracked. But the real blow was yet to come. After closing arguments, the courtroom held its breath as Judge Robinson prepared to deliver her verdict. She reviewed the evidence, her voice steady, each word hitting like a hammer. Mr. Grayson, she began, this case was never just about financial misconduct. It was about accountability. You believed you were above the law. Today, you've learned otherwise. She listed the charges: fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, and then the sentence. Ethan's jaw tightened as she delivered the final ruling. Significant prison time, hefty fines, and restitution payments that would strip him of more than just his money. But it wasn't the sentence that broke him. It was her final words. Mr. Grayson, wealth may build empires, but character builds legacies. And today, your legacy is nothing more than a cautionary tale. The courtroom erupted, not in applause, but in silent acknowledgement of a lesson taught without shouting, without force, just the undeniable weight of truth. Ethan Grayson had finally met something he couldn't buy his way out of: consequences. Just when everyone thought the trial had reached its peak, Judge Maya Robinson adjusted her glasses and said, "Before I conclude, there's something that needs to be addressed." The courtroom, already tense from Ethan Grayson's dramatic downfall, grew even quieter. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier arrogance now reduced to a fragile shell. Judge Robinson continued, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. This isn't the first time Mr. Grayson's actions have come under scrutiny. Years ago, before he was the billionaire sitting here today, he was involved in another case, one that never made headlines, because money has a way of burying the truth. Ethan's face went pale. His lawyer glanced at him, clearly caught off guard. The judge reached for a folder, thin but significant, and opened it. You see, long before I sat on this bench, I was a public defender. And back then, I represented someone whose life was nearly destroyed because of decisions Mr. Grayson made. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Maya's gaze locked on Ethan. You don't remember, do you? Because to people like you, lives ruined by your greed are just numbers on a balance sheet. Ethan's mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but no words came out. Judge Robinson continued, her voice steady. A man whose company was crushed by unethical business practices Mr. Grayson authorized, hidden behind layers of corporate paperwork. That man lost everything: his business, his home, his family. But he wasn't just a name on a file to me. He was a person. And that case changed the way I saw the world. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. That case fueled my decision to become a judge, because I realized that real justice isn't just about the law. It's about holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they think they are. Ethan's arrogance had nowhere to hide. His usual smug grin was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped stare. his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. But there was no escaping this. Judge Robinson leaned slightly forward. "Today, Mr. Grayson, you stood in my courtroom believing you were untouchable. But the irony is, you're here because of choices you made long before you ever met me. Choices that hurt people you'll never remember. But I do." The room was silent, everyone processing the revelation. This wasn't just a trial about fraud and embezzlement. It was the closing of a circle, a confrontation with consequences Ethan thought he'd outrun. Judge Robinson closed the folder gently. Justice isn't always immediate. Sometimes it waits silently for the right moment. And today, Mr. Grayson, justice found you. Ethan slumped slightly in his seat, his confidence shattered, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to face consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. The courtroom was still, the silence almost louder than any of Ethan Grayson's outbursts. His once smug face was now hollow. His confidence crumbled like a fragile mask ripped away. But the lesson wasn't just for Ethan. Everyone in that room had witnessed something they wouldn't forget. Judge Maya Robinson's final words lingered long after she left the bench. Ethan was escorted out of the courtroom, his expensive suit wrinkled, his head lowered, not from shame, perhaps, but from a realization he couldn't ignore. His money had no power here. Weeks later, his face splashed across newspapers, not as the untouchable billionaire, but as the man who faced justice. His empire crumbled piece by piece, investors pulling out, his reputation in ruins. He served time, not in some luxury facility, but in a place where his name carried no weight, his wealth offering no comfort. And for the first time, Ethan Grayson was forced to sit with nothing but his thoughts. But this story isn't just about Ethan. It's about Judge Maya Robinson, the woman who stood her ground, not with anger, but with quiet, undeniable strength. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Her actions spoke louder than words. She showed that true power isn't about wealth or status. It's about integrity, resilience, and the courage to do what's right. Even when no one's watching, Maya continued her work, presiding over cases with the same grace and fairness she'd always shown. But that day stayed with her, not because she finally got to face Ethan Grayson, but because it reminded her why she chose this path. Not for recognition, not for power, but to be a voice for those who'd been silenced by people like him. One day, after court, a young law student approached her. "Judge Robinson," she said, nervously adjusting her glasses, "how do you stay so calm when facing people like him?" Maya smiled softly, her eyes thoughtful. "Because the moment you let their arrogance control your emotions, they've already won. The real strength is knowing who you are, without needing to prove it." The student nodded, scribbling the words down as if they were gold, and maybe they were. Because the lesson wasn't just for Ethan. It was for anyone who ever believed respect is something you demand, rather than something you earn. Ethan's story became a cautionary tale, shared in classrooms, news articles, and whispered among people who'd once envied his life. Not because of his downfall, but because of what it revealed. Money can buy many things, but it can't buy respect. It can't buy integrity, and it certainly can't buy character. Years later, when Maya walked into another courtroom, the same ritual happened. All rise, and people stood not just out of obligation, but because they understood what she represented. Not power, but justice. And that's the legacy that lasts. Sometimes, the loudest lessons come from the quietest moments. Ethan Grayson believed his money and status made him untouchable, but it was a simple courtroom and a woman with unshakable integrity that showed him the truth. In the end, it wasn't his empire, his wealth, or his connections that defined him. It was his character, or lack of it. Judge Maya Robinson didn't need to shout, threaten, or belittle. She let justice speak for itself. And that's the thing about respect. It can't be bought, faked, or demanded. It's earned through actions, choices, and the way we treat others when we think no one's watching. So here's something to think about. Have you ever witnessed someone's arrogance backfire spectacularly? A moment when life taught them a lesson money couldn't buy. Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this story made you pause, reflect, or even feel a little inspired, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the stories that hit hardest aren't about the ones who rise without effort. They're about the ones who fall when they forget what truly matters. Thanks for watching. And remember, real power doesn't come from wealth or titles. It comes from character.